Well, good evening, everyone. I'm Kim Hankins, the Director of Sustainability here at McHenry County College. Thank you so much for coming out for our second night in our Bioneer Speaker Series. We're happy to have you all. I know some of you were here last week, and thank you so much for coming back. And to the new faces, thank you as well for joining us on this special evening. Now to introduce our speaker is our friend and fellow committee member, Emily Zach. Emily is a graduate of McHenry County College and has been the farm manager over at the Loyola University Retreat and Ecology Center for about 2 years. We at MCC have really enjoyed working with Emily and Lurick, so please welcome Emily.
Hi, welcome. Thank you for coming out tonight. I have the great pleasure to introduce Danielle Nierenberg. To summarize her achievements in a minute is impossible. She has done amazing things around the world to help heal and improve our food systems, but I'm going to try. After earning her MS in Agriculture, Food, and the Environment from Tufts University, Danielle completed 2 years in the Peace Corps in the Dominican Republic. She spent 2 years traveling to more than 35 countries across sub-Saharan Africa, Asia, and Latin America, talking to farmers, scientists, researchers, and government workers, documenting what's working to help alleviate hunger and poverty and what's not, all while protecting the environment. She has contributed to countless publications and has been cited in more than 8,000 major print and broadcast outlets worldwide. Danielle has spoken at hundreds of major conferences and events all over the world. In 2013, she co-founded the nonprofit Food Tank. This organization focuses on building a global community for safe, healthy, and nourished eaters that spotlights environmentally, socially, and economically sustainable ways of alleviating hunger, obesity, and poverty, and to create networks of people, organizations, and content to push for food system change. Danielle is also an expert on sustainable agriculture and food issues. She has written extensively on gender and population, the spread of factory farming in developing worlds, and innovations in sustainable agriculture. We are very excited to have her here tonight. Danielle Nierenberg.
I don't think I need to give a speech after that introduction, so, but I do want to thank all of you for being here, and especially thank McHenry County College and Bioneers for having me. It's, you know, I go to these kind of events a lot, but it's such a huge pleasure and honor to be here and be with all of you who came out on a snowy night. And I'm especially excited to be here because I think the people in this room that it's really no exaggeration to say that you're all on the leading edge of the movement for a better food system. You know, I'm in awe of all the students that are going to this college. I think their generation is thinking critically about food and agriculture issues in a way that my generation just didn't. And because they are thinking more globally, and because all of you are thinking more globally, farmers, companies, policymakers, the funding and donor communities are changing their practices and developing innovations that will not only nourish people, but also the planet. And you know, again, going back to students, I'm really excited to see where all of you will take the food system over the next few generations. And you know, again, it's inspiring that you all came out on a snowy night, so thank you. I'm also pretty hopeful that all of you share the hope that I have. My hope that there are environmentally, socially, and economically sustainable ways that we can put in place today to build a food system that makes hunger, obesity, food waste, and other environmental and social challenges part of the world's past, not its future. And I think that there is actually a recipe for this kind of change. And you know, the ingredients for sustainable agriculture, I think, are constantly changing and evolving. So what I'd like to do tonight, with your permission, is talk about some of those ingredients and you know, what the recipe contains, and who are the cooks, and how can we support them. This is not a recipe that I came up with on my own, but by interviewing hundreds and hundreds of of farmers and researchers and scientists and food advocates and activists and journalists and donors and people who are actively working on the ground every day to improve the food system. I've had this really amazing opportunity to now have traveled to 60 plus countries all over the world, sub-Saharan Africa especially, but also Asia, Latin America, and elsewhere. And it really gave me, sorry, I'm having trouble with my mic. I think it gave me a really unique opportunity to hear firsthand what these people who are actively doing this work think it will take to overcome hunger and poverty and the other problems that I mentioned a few minutes ago, while also protecting the environment in their own countries. And ironically, their recommendations are not that different from farmers I've listened to in the United States and Canada. And meeting all of these people over the last several years was an incredible experience, not only because I learned that despite all of our differences and different political views, different geographical boundaries, that there really is a shared belief that the world's current response to hunger and poverty isn't working, and that we need different viewpoints, and we need to really follow the lead of people in their own communities rather than insisting that they follow our lead. And one farmer I spoke with in Kenya put it to me best. He said that he's been innovating all along, just as his father and grandfather used to do. And this sort of innovative and entrepreneurial capacity is really evident all over the developing world. In Ethiopia, I met with farmers who are developing low-cost rainwater harvesting and erosion control techniques to battle both drought and poverty, while also increasing both their yields and their incomes. In India, I met with women entrepreneurs who are providing low-cost, high-quality food to the urban poor who would otherwise not have access to these foods. In the Gambia, I met with fisher folk who are finding ways to protect marine resources and preserve fish harvests. In Brazil, I encountered farmers from all over the world who had gathered to encourage more investment from political leaders in smallholder agriculture, and to let these policymakers know that farmers deserve to be recognized for all the services they provide in addition to food production, that they are economic drivers, that they are protectors of biodiversity, that they can help mitigate greenhouse gas emissions. And there were countless other stakeholders, farmers, business leaders, policymakers, who've really showed me what the components of a sustainable food system could look like globally. And after spending all of this time on the ground, I'm convinced that the way things are isn't the way they have to be. I'm convinced that we can help build a food system that combats poverty and alleviates hunger, not by treating the natural environment as an obstacle to sustainable growth, but by realizing it's a precondition for it. A food system where science is our servant, not our master, and where it's understood that costly, complicated technologies aren't always the most appropriate technologies. And a food system that honors our values, where women, workers, and consumers all have a seat at the table and no one is left on the outside looking in. And we have a real opportunity to build that kind of system, but we don't have a minute to waste. So tonight, I'm just going to discuss again a few components, a few ingredients of a strategy to build that kind of food system. And as I said, there are lots of different ingredients. They can change over time, but the ones that I'm going to talk about this evening are really ones that I think deserve more attention, more research, and ultimately more funding and attention globally. First is preserving what may be agriculture's most important but overlooked input, soil. Second, finding ways to prevent food loss and food waste. Third, growing food in the world's cities. Fourth, investing in more nutritious foods. And last but not least, recognizing the really important role that women have to play in the food system worldwide. So I'm just going to start with the ground beneath our feet. And I think everyone in this room knows that soil is more than just dirt. It is really the foundation of a healthy food system, storing and filtering water, providing resilience to drought, and sequestering carbon in addition to being the medium in which we grow our food. The loss of topsoil, however, could be one of the biggest threats to our food supply. Unfortunately, this vital ingredient is being degraded and eroded at unprecedented rates across the world. According to the United Nations Food and Agriculture Organization, 25% of the planet's land is highly degraded, and only 10% is improving. Half of the topsoil on the planet has been lost over the last 150 years. And just over the past 40 years, 30% of the world's arable land has become unproductive. Deforestation in China is causing the Los Plateau to erode rapidly. Overgrazing of grassland in the western United States is reducing soil depth and creating desertification. In India, overcutting trees and crops is reducing soil fertility and threatening wild medicinal plants. And industrial agricultural practices across the globe are exposing topsoil to the elements and increasing erosion. Brazil alone loses 55 million tons of topsoil every year because of one crop, and that's soybean production. Wes Jackson is a pretty well-known agronomist and a mentor of mine. He founded the Land Institute, and he says that we're plowing through our soil bank account and sending those riches downstream to the ocean. But there are solutions. And one really important one is growing a diversity of crops. Monoculture crops like maize and soybeans tend to be very hard on soils, depleting them of nutrients, rather than restoring the soils back. But growing crops in rotation and growing a variety of crops can help restore soils and really help farmers, whether they're large or small, get more nutrients per hectare or acre. In Western Africa, for example, farmers are raising cattle and using that manure to fertilize crops and promote earthworm production. This is something that farmers do all over the world, including here in the United States. And it not only helps restore the vital nutrients to the soils, but it helps protect soil microbiota, which I'm sure you're all aware of, the little critters that live in the soil and help keep it healthy. The other thing that using manure as fertilizer does is it helps save farmers money by eliminating the need to buy artificial fertilizer out of a bag. Artificial fertilizer, particularly in the developing world, can be very expensive and place a huge economic burden on smallholder farmers who are barely scraping by. Another mentor of mine is Jerry Glover, who works with the U.S. Agency for International Development, and he's an expert on perennial crops. And what he's been doing is calling for more research into perennials, because unlike annuals, perennial crops survive from season to season. They have deep root structures that can stabilize soils and get water more easily than annual crops. And perennials such as sorghum, peas, and different varieties of beans are also very nutritious, providing an extra source of food to families in the developing world. This year was declared by the United Nations as the International Year of Pulses. And pulses, like beans, are a really inexpensive source of protein that can nourish communities all over the globe very inexpensively. More than half of the world's population depends on marginal lands that are unsuited for producing annual crops like corn or soybeans. But perennial crops can be produced sustainably on a lot of these marginal lands, and again, really help improve farmers' yields, incomes, and nutrition for communities. Farmers all over the world are also realizing that they can revitalize soils by incorporating cover crops, such as winter wheat, rye, and clover. And here in the US, and particularly the Midwest, there's a slogan that farmers are using that is, don't farm naked. And it's become very popular for farmers to use cover crops to prevent erosion between plantings, and again, add nutrients back to the soil rather than continually depleting them. The second ingredient in addition to soil that I want to talk about is finding ways to minimize food loss and food waste. And I don't think you have to be religious to recognize that it's a sin that today roughly 40% of the global harvest is lost before it ever reaches people's stomachs. In the United States alone, roughly 1/3 of food is thrown away by consumers and retailers because of very simple things like misinterpretation of expiration and sell-by dates or overbuying. In sub-Saharan Africa and other parts of the world, an equal amount of food is lost because of poor infrastructure, pests, and disease that plague crops. And so as a result, all of the hard work that farmers put into producing crops goes to waste. And what, all of the work that we as eaters do goes to waste because we're losing a lot of money for all of the food that we buy that is wasted. Food waste tends to be insidious. A little bit is lost in a field, a little bit is lost in storage, a little bit is lost in transport, and then finally a few percent is lost in homes and restaurants and grocery stores. And while wasting food presents some obvious moral conundrums, it also presents some serious environmental challenges. Food releases methane gas as it decomposes in landfills. And methane, as many of you know, is a greenhouse gas that is about 27 times more potent than carbon dioxide. According to the U.S. Environmental Protection Agency, landfills are the third largest source of human-related methane emissions in the United States. Again, there's good news, and preventing food waste can be very simple and inexpensive. And some of the most interesting innovations are actually happening in the developing world. In the Gambia and also in India, I visited with farmers who are drying papayas and mangoes, helping make sure that families have access to vitamin A throughout the year and extra income from the sale of dried food. The season for mangoes tends to be very short, so you get a lot of product in a very short time, and often there's just more than people can eat at one time. So drying and adding value to this product can be very beneficial, and again, an important source of both nutrition and income. Another organization I've had the pleasure of dealing with is called the 1 Acre Fund in Eastern Africa. And they've started working with, they work with about 300,000 farmers, and they are using simple tracking sheets to let farmers sort of figure out how much food they're producing each year and how much food they're using, so that they can know from one year to the next how much their harvest is, how much is lost to pests, how much is eaten, so that being able to track what they're growing can really help them prevent food from being lost. 1 Acre Fund is also working with these farmers to develop better storage practices, including using hermetically sealed bags that can keep out mold and pests and disease. On the consumer side, which is all of us, the solutions to limiting food waste can also be really simple and ineffective. And here's a mantra that I try to use, although I'm not always good at it. Don't buy more than what you can eat. Store your produce properly. Take leftovers home, and don't throw away food that hasn't gone bad. Trust your senses, or really learn to trust your senses, not expiration dates, to tell yourself whether food is safe to eat. I think we've all looked at those expiration dates and think they're like God's word. And in reality, we need to sort of sniff and touch and look at food before we decide whether it's good to eat. There are a lot of really important nonprofit groups that are working to educate consumers. Love Food, Hate Waste is one in the United Kingdom that is educating consumers by offering tips for food storage and recipes to make use of leftovers that are close to their expiration date. They've also developed a really cool portion size calculator that helps new cooks especially know how much food to cook per person, because I think we've all been in a situation where our eyes are bigger than our stomachs and we overbuy, we overcook food. So having a way to understand what a correct portion size looks like can be very helpful. But this action on the consumer side does not absolve retailers and manufacturers from their responsibilities. And I've been excited over the last year to follow what Intermarché, which is a grocery chain in France, is doing. They've been marketing ugly vegetables and ugly fruits, the things that we normally wouldn't buy, the things that are a little discolored or a little bumpy looking or just look weird, and marketing them to their consumers with these really clever ad campaigns that make ugly food seem sexy. Other companies are following suit, including one of the biggest food retailers in Canada. I'm also excited that Congresswoman Shelley Pingree of Maine has introduced food waste legislation that will, among other things, help federally regulate sell by, use by, and expiration dates on foods. Again, we all think that these are, the law, that these numbers actually mean something, but they're not federally regulated for most foods. The only foods that they're regulated for are baby food. So the other, numbers that you're looking at, use by, by April 3rd or sell by a particular date, they don't mean much. And so being able to federally regulate them and identify what each of these terms mean will be really helpful in helping consumers know when produce and packaged foods are good to eat. In addition, the Rockefeller Foundation pledged in Davos at the World Economic Forum last month to invest $130 million in preventing food loss in sub-Saharan Africa. Investment like this is important because it is the first time that there has been such a large-scale effort in innovation and financing to stop preventable food loss in the developing world. So it will be exciting to follow what happens. I should also add that organizations like City Harvest, which is based in New York City, has been a real pioneer in collecting food that would have otherwise been wasted from restaurants and hotels and catering services and distributing it to homeless shelters and low-income families across New York City. In a similar vein, the Food Recovery Network is mobilizing hundreds of college and university students to collect perishable food from their campuses and distribute it to those in need. The next component of this recipe that I want to talk about is farming the cities. Increasing sustainable agriculture in cities around the world could have a lot of impact on food security, nutrition, and incomes for urban residents. Urbanization rates are expected to increase 70% by 2050. And if we're going to feed those families, we'll need to make sure that cities and towns are not only, consumers of food, but also centers of food production. Worldwide, there are nearly 1 billion urban farmers, and many are having the greatest impacts in communities where hunger and poverty are most acute. For example, a few years ago, I had the opportunity to visit Kibera, which is believed to be the largest slum in sub-Saharan Africa. It's within Nairobi, and there are anywhere from 700,000 to 1 million residents. What some farmers in Kibera have done is develop some really innovative gardens, and they call them vertical gardens. And essentially, they're tall, empty rice or maize sacks that they fill with soil. They're about 4 feet tall. They poke holes all on different sort of layers of the bag, and they grow leafy greens, spinach, kale, other crops. And at harvest time, they're able to sell some of their produce to their neighbors and consume part of what they grow in their own homes. But the value of these sacks shouldn't be underestimated. They're not just backyard gardens. During the riots that occurred in Nairobi in 2007 and 2008, And again, in 2011, no food could be transported into Kibera. And the urban farmers who were using these sacks were one of the only sources of food for communities for days at a time. These farmers are credited with really feeding hundreds of families and keeping, men, women, and children from going hungry during what was a very chaotic time in the city. And I think the role of urban farmers in Kibera and other slums is really only a precursor of things to come. In much of the less developed world, food purchases can take up as much as 80% of a family's income. And in countries where war and instability can send the cost of food skyrocketing overnight, urban agriculture will be really helpful and fundamental in helping prevent food riots and wide-scale hunger. And so in that respect, I think promoting urban agriculture isn't something that only, is environmentally right or correct, but it's also something that is morally smart and necessary for regional stability. And this is something that's not only taking place in the developing world. Across the United States, including in Chicago and other urban areas across Illinois, urban agriculture is helping not only provide urban consumers with fresh, healthy produce, but also helping youth learn leadership skills. Former pro basketball player and farmer Will Allen started the organization Growing Power to help train at-risk youth how to grow, market, and prepare food in Chicago, Milwaukee, and now they're expanding into other cities across the country. And community gardens and farmers markets can really help create green space within cities where people can come together in sort of a low-key environment and learn about food. The next component I want to talk about of this recipe is the need for improving the variety of food that people have access to and can really afford. One consequence of the Green Revolution that happened in the 1960s is that over the last 50 or so years, agricultural production has focused really on starchy staple crops and less on more nutritious foods, certainly fruits and vegetables, but also nutritious grains and livestock products. And so now we're countries all over the world, not just in the developing world, but also Europe and North America, are really focused on producing corn, wheat, soy, rice, and less on, more nutritious foods like millet, sorghum, perennial grains that I talked about before, and again, fruits and vegetables. And while it's very true that most of us, but especially the poor in the developing world, get most of our calories from some of these starchy staple crops, there's been very little research and very little funding into what makes those starchy staple crops both tasty or palatable and nutritious. In fact, funding on research for cereals and grains is now roughly 13 times the amount spent on fruit and vegetable research worldwide. And that lack of investment comes at a really high price. The World Vegetable Center is a research center located in Taiwan, but has centers all over sub-Saharan Africa. And they've done a lot of studies looking at the availability of fruits and vegetables in particular countries. And the very simple conclusion they came to is that the fewer fruits and vegetables available to children under 5 in a particular country, the higher the child mortality rates. So because of this lack of investment on fruits and vegetables, children are literally dying. And it's not just the death rates that are a consequence of this lack of investment, but also we're curbing economic and personal development. Children can't learn when they're not eating nutritious foods, when they lack micronutrients. So we're really helping, keep these countries poor because we're not investing in fruits and vegetables. If that wasn't enough, the lack of focus on more nutritious crops is really a principal factor in the overweight and obesity epidemic. This is a crisis now facing some 2.1 billion people worldwide in industrial countries and the developing world alike. This is more than the 800 million people who are currently hungry today. In the United States, over 30% of Americans are obese. Mexico has a 70% obesity rate. And even in India, which used to be the poster child for world hunger, at least 17% of adults are obese. Along with this epidemic in overweight and obesity, there's been a huge surge in cardiovascular, respiratory diseases, and type 2 diabetes. These are diseases that will cost $30 trillion between now and 2030. So it's clear that we need a shift from simply filling people up with calories to increasing consumption of more nutritious foods like fruits and vegetables. And these, increasing consumption and production of these crops is not only good for public health, but it's also something that can improve in environmental protection and also help reduce poverty. I met with an interesting group in Uganda called Developing Innovations in School Cultivation, or Project DISC. And its founder, Eddie Mukibi, is now the vice president of Slow Food International. And he started working with more than 24 schools to teach kids from preschoolers to high school age how to grow and cultivate and eventually market indigenous fruits and vegetables. Fruits and vegetables that were particular to his community. These indigenous crops are often considered weeds or poor people's foods, and they're looked down upon, but they're actually can be very, very nutritious. They're, greens like spider wiki, different varieties of kale and spinach, all of these other vegetables that I can't pronounce can, again, not only be very nutritious for communities, but also resilient to pests and disease. They can withstand flooding, they can withstand drought. So it's making them really important crops of the future because they'll be resilient to some of the environmental crises the world is facing. The final ingredient that I want to talk about tonight is about cultivating more equality in the food system. And last year I did a TEDx talk on this, and when I was preparing it, I just became very sort of frustrated because it's absurd to me that women make up more than half of the world's population and that they make up nearly half of the world's farmers, but their contributions as food producers go almost universally unnoticed. For a lot of people, when they think of farmers, they think of men sitting in the cabs of tractors or combines and big corn or soybean fields across the Midwest. And, that's not the kind of agriculture I'm talking about. I'm talking about women who tend dairy cows in Ghana, who pick tomatoes in Florida, who harvest tea in India, and who dry fish in Japan. Women make up at least 43% of the global agricultural labor force. And in some countries, especially in sub-Saharan Africa, they make up as many as 80% of all farmers. This invisible sisterhood really is the world's food producers. And yet, they are often denied access to the very same things that male farmers can get very easily. Education, credit, loans, the ability to access an extension agent or reach out to a research organization. They are routinely discriminated against simply by the fact that they are women. And, this frustrates me as a woman who has spent a lot of time interviewing these women farmers across the world. They're often portrayed as victims, but I think that image really needs to change. They are businesswomen. They are stewards of the land. Many have other careers in addition to farming that help put food on the table every day. They are caretakers of rich cultural traditions. preserving indigenous crops, and protecting biodiversity. And this all really occurs in the service of food that people actually eat. You know, women farmers are not producing maize and soybeans and rice. They're producing the crops that, you know, people want to eat, the fruits and vegetables, the nutritious grains. They're raising the small livestock. And it's men who are raising, for the most part, raising cash and commodity crops. The women farmers that I've met all over the world, work very, very hard. They work harder than most of the men I've met. They certainly work harder than I do. And they do things that that they're not acknowledged for. They cook, they clean, they take care of sick elders, they fetch water. And, you know, all of this continues because they don't get the recognition that they need. Their roles as caretakers, as food producers are ignored to the extreme. And what bothers me, I think, with the food movement in the United States, we all think if we buy more local food or if we eat more organic, that's going to change things. But it doesn't matter how much of this we do unless we encourage the funding in donor communities and the foundations all over the world and research organizations all over the world to really invest in what women farmers want and need as food producers, and then really work with them to find ways to provide it. And the importance of talking to women became very clear for me a few years ago. I shared this story earlier today, but it bears worth repeating. You know, I was sitting with a group of women farmers outside of Ahmedabad, India, and had spent the day with them interviewing them about, you know, how they were practicing organic agriculture, the different things that they were doing, how they're marketing their products to urban consumers with their own brand and their own label. And sort of after I'd finished and talking to them, or thought I had, and closed my notebook, they turned to me and they wanted to know, because they understood that I had traveled a lot and talked to farmers all over the world, they wanted to know what women farmers in other parts of the world were doing. What were women farmers in Ethiopia doing, Danielle? How were they combating climate change? How were they building resilience in their own farms? And you know, I was able to share with them what I know, and since then, part of my mission and Food Tank's mission has been to share as many stories as possible and really highlight what's working on the ground. Again, to, you know, not only alleviate hunger and poverty, but what are the practices being used that can also contribute to environmental sustainability. You know, in Niger, I met with another group of amazing women who had established a communal garden, and they were using solar drip irrigation to grow fruits and vegetables and other crops. And before they started the garden, each of these women was making about $300 a year. So that's obviously less than $1 a day. And today, with this communal garden, they're making about $1,500 a year. And, you know, I like to imagine what my life would be like if I was making 5 times more next year than I am right now. You know, what sorts of incredible things could I be doing? And, you know, for these women, it's more than money that they've gained. They've really been able to innovate their way to a sustainable life. And, you know, and I could talk all day, I won't, about how women farmers are really changing the world. But they're making the food system more sustainable. And sustainability in agriculture for me is not just a catchphrase or a fad. When I'm talking about sustainability, what I really mean is a system that doesn't lurch from crisis to crisis. A food system that doesn't, you know, chew people up, for lack of a better pun, and spit them out. Sustainability is what happens when techniques for surviving drought years or creating resilience to flooding are shared with the people who need them the most. And sustainability is really what happens when women who are making 90 cents a day are now making $5 a day by using more sustainable agriculture practices. and really providing a better life for themselves and their families. There's a reason that this slideshow has only women farmers on it. I want to remind people that women make up at least half of the world's farmers. And in the United States, they're really sort of the beacon for sustainable agriculture. You know, we have great spokespeople like Michael Pollan and Mark Bittman, but it's really women who are doing the hard work of carrying sustainable agriculture forward in this country, and I think it's important to remind people of that. And, you know, again, I think the definitions of sustainability that I'm talking about are really, you know, much better than sort of the standard definition of sustainability, which has been so watered down that it doesn't mean anything to most people anymore. And, you know, I think that there is a clear path forward, and I think that we need to really listen to women farmers in particular, but all small-scale farmers. We'll really need to listen to the things that these farmers want and need. And we'll need to listen to all of you, because in the big cycle of food, many of us, including a lot of you in this room, are producers, but all of us are eaters. And I think, you know, we'll begin to see progress. The urgency of these issues is very immediate, but so are the solutions. And I think that what I've been able to see over and over again in my work and my travels is that not only are women farmers leading the way, but smallholder and medium-scale farmers across the globe are really leading the way. There are 500 million family farms across the globe. They're producing 70% of the world's food. If women had the same access to resources as male farmers, including land, credit, education, extension services, they could increase food production. Just women farmers alone could increase food production by 20 to 30% and lift as many as 150 million people out of hunger and food insecurity. And that really brings me to my last and final point. The ability to use sustainable agriculture to create a more robust and resilient food system. A food system that doesn't contribute to climate change, but can help reverse it. And that's not only resistant to food price shocks, trade wars, and conflicts, but can help prevent them. Against that kind of backdrop, sustainable agriculture is not an option for the world, it's really a necessity. From Africa to Latin America to Asia, I've had this incredible honor to meet with literally hundreds of men and women who are really on the leading edge of the greatest transformation of agriculture in our lifetimes. They're not scientists. Most have never even finished school. They're not only separated by geography, but by faith and traditions that go back generations long before any of us were born. But together, they share a common vision, a vision of a world where no one's future is determined in corporate boardrooms 5,000 miles away, a vision of communities where everyone understands that you don't need to destroy the environment to feed your family, a vision of a food system that's built to last and an economy that leaves no one behind, a vision grounded in believing that the way things are isn't the way they have to be. So what I would like to do tonight is really ask all of you to send them the message that that's really our vision too, that we believe in them, that we want to support them, that we can create the kind of food system where everyone eats and the environment is protected. So I think I'll end there. Thank you all so much, and I'm happy to take questions. There's someone in the front. Oh, okay, sorry, there's one. Hi.
You talk about preserving land around the world, and here in McHenry County, and in northern Illinois in general, we have some of the greatest agricultural land in the planet, and yet our loss is not quite the same. The biological systems you were talking about of preserving it, ours being lost to development for the most part.
Right.
McHenry County has lost a huge amount of agricultural land. And just recently, two of our local towns had a joint economic development zone. that includes a large swath of agricultural land where they encourage development, and politicians and developers keep servicing each other, I guess. Any recommendations you make on fighting that problem?
You all are fighting the good fight every day, and I think, supporting organizations like the American Farmland Trust and some of these conservation organizations, and what is it, environmental defenders here? I mean, supporting those organizations with not only your dollars, but your volunteerism and your support can really help curb a lot of that. I mean, you have to really reach the policymakers, and that can happen in a lot of different ways. I think social media for my organization and for so many students and young people is such a powerful tool, and being able to galvanize that and really encourage, legislators to make change. I think we forget the power of our vote in this country, and especially during an election year. Vote for the kind of food system that you want, and vote for the legislators who believe in that, or kick them out because they don't deserve, your support or taxpayers' money.
You seem to indicate that the solution of, world hunger is a movement away from the corn, soybean, wheat towards more vegetables and fruits. But what do you see as the role of livestock? You have a lot of slides up there that show hogs, goats, beef cattle, dairy, milk. So what do you see as that fitting into the solution?
Absolutely, and I mentioned livestock very briefly in my talk. I think there needs to be more investment in especially small-scale livestock across the globe. Very efficient animals like grass cutters or rabbits here in the United States that provide a lot of protein very cheaply. More investment in small-scale poultry production, and eliminating a lot of these really monster farms that are producing tens of thousands of eggs or broilers every day. Those, in addition to the effect from pollution that they have on communities, they also are very risky in terms of spreading zoonotic diseases like avian flu or swine flu, if we're talking about pigs and hogs. So, I think livestock, and again, especially small-scale livestock, has a huge role to play in increasing nutrition and raising incomes for small and large farmers alike.
Hi, I just want to make a comment about women in the food system. I'm from Shared Harvest. We're a cooperative that's forming in Elgin, and I'm wondering if anyone from the food shed is here. Okay, a cooperative forming in, I know, in this area. And I want to tell you that, so we are trying to open a grocery store that supports our local farmers, more organic, more, sustainably raised foods and meats, etc. And we're 80% women owners.
Yay! Any other thoughts? I mean, I'm not just interested in questions. I'm interested in what you all are doing in this community. I've learned a lot today, but if you want to share stories or...
Yeah, I will comment on the heels of what this gentleman in the front row just said. I'm, besides a food enthusiast and an eater, I'm also a prairie enthusiast, and I've been reading more. The conventional wisdom in prairie restoration is that you burn it every few years, and my thinking about livestock has been that livestock is a problem because of the methane generated and things like that. But I've been reading more and more and hearing more and more about livestock is also the solution to the problem, because the way we do livestock, especially in America, is that we do them in these huge numbers and we keep them confined in small spaces, which tends to degrade the earth. But if we do it the way that nature evolved, with these huge animals roaming the prairies and not staying in one place very long, but moving and dropping their nutrients on the prairie. And not only is that the way nature intended, but it's also apparently, and it appears to me that we could restore the topsoil this way. The land that's been degraded can actually be brought back and sequester carbon and pull it out of the atmosphere and pump it into the ground where it belongs and where it used to be. And I don't know, just a comment. I don't know if you have anything to say about that.
Absolutely, and leaders like Alan Savory, who has developed this, what he calls holistic managed grazing, all across sub-Saharan Africa, is exactly what you're talking about, using large animals to regenerate native grasses, native prairies, native savannas, in places like Brazil, and being able to use grass-fed meat as a way to help mitigate climate change. Livestock, like farmers, are often blamed for a lot of the Earth's ills, but it's the way that we manage these livestock. We create, we've turned manure from a really valuable resource into toxic waste with these factory farms that exist not only in the United States, but all over the world now. So if we can, rethink what manure is and realize how valuable it is, we can, solve a lot of these problems. Again, it's, I talked about this a little bit earlier. Manure is so valuable, and it's especially valuable to small-scale farmers who can't afford and frankly don't want to use artificial fertilizer. And we've dismissed it, and we try to throw it away rather than making it into a really valuable input. There's someone right there.
Hi, I'm a food writer, and I attend lots of conferences on food and different topics, and what I find is that most people don't really address the issue of GMOs. I don't know if it's because there isn't enough science to back up the data, or if it's because people really don't know what to say about it, but I'm interested to know what you heard from farmers across the world, because I know on a small scale from the people that I talk to, there's so much concern about it, and myself as a farmer and lover of organic, I'm really concerned and worried about where that's going.
It's a great question, and I used to bring it up in talks a lot, but I felt like it took up all the oxygen in the room, because either people are, on one side or the other, they're very extreme. Here's what I will say, and it's really based on, again, talking to farmers and listening to them. The technology is very interesting, right? It's very sexy. If you read enough about it, you're like, wow, this is great. And if you read enough sort of on the pro-GMO side, you're like, wow, this could really save the world. But here's the reality is that GMOs from in a lot of ways have not really lived up to their promises. They were intended to increase yields, reduce dependence on herbicides and some other agrochemicals, and raise farmers' incomes. And when you look at the data, and there is plenty of scientific evidence out there, and there are links on the Food Tank website, and I'm also happy to send links to people, the yields are kind of comparable. The GMO crops are not getting crazy yields that are that much more than even conventional or organic even. They haven't reduced dependence on these sort of, other inputs like herbicides or fertilizers. And in fact, in some cases, they've increased the use of herbicides, and that's, has its own problems. And farmers are not making more money from these crops. So whether I think that the technology has potential or not, it doesn't matter to me, because I know that there are so many other practices that we know work, that we could be investing billions of dollars. Over the last 20 years, biotechnology in agriculture has gotten so much investment, and we're not, we still have nearly 1 billion people who are hungry. We still have all of the environmental problems from industrial agriculture. So what I would like to see is that investment really refocused to the things that we already know work. Agroecological practices, conservation agriculture, organic agriculture practices, things that we already know can increase yields, help farmers make more money, help people eat better.
Nancy, you're going to be our last question.
Well, it's sort of a two-part thing. I'd like to make a comment and then ask your input on this. Considering food waste, it always bothers, I think probably most of us in the room, that so often when we go out to eat or when you think about schools serving lunches or anywhere where people gather to eat, there's an awful lot of food that ends up getting thrown away. In fact, there are certain laws in the state, and I'm sure this is probably true throughout the U.S., that prevents that leftover food from being given away. And there is, just so everyone is aware, there is a bill that is being introduced in our state legislature this year that will allow places such as schools to give away food that has not been consumed. Second part of this is, then do you know how that sort of thing is handled in other places in the U.S.? Is it common to allow food to be given away, or is it against the law in other places as well?
So many groups are now, trying to find places for food that would otherwise go to waste. I mentioned a few of them in my talk. The Food Recovery Network works with college campuses all over the United States to collect food from, campus catering or events and distribute it to homeless shelters. You can circumvent those laws. The funny thing about the law, and I can't remember, it's the food, I can't remember the entire name of the law, but no one has ever been sued as a result of that law. And so that's what we don't realize. They're not lawyers who are like out there chasing, people who want to give away food. And so changing the legislation will be very helpful. That's part of Shelley Pingree's legislation as well, and it's sort of a national level. But, there are so many groups like, and I mentioned a few, City Harvest in New York City, DC Central Kitchen in Washington, DC. There are groups all over the Chicagoland area that are recovering food and giving it to institutions where it can be used or repurposed. In Boston, the Daily Table is a restaurant/grocery store that was opened by the former head of Trader Joe's, Doug Roche, to repurpose food that would otherwise go to waste, give it to people at a lower cost than they would pay for, sort of new food, and so providing communities the ability to feed themselves without being given a handout. And I think that's where some of these food recovery programs, might have some issues, because you don't want to make poor people or people who can't, who are food insecure feel like they're being given leftovers. You want them to have, some pride in what they're eating. And so being able to, open a grocery store like the Daily Table allows people, to use the limited income they do have to really buy safe, nutritious food without feeling like they're getting a handout.
All right, one more question. I'm sorry. I'm kind of weak when it comes to questions. I have one more question. I promise this is it this time.
I think one of the really serious things we all have to keep in mind is the effect of all this high chemical use that is being exhibited on health. There's a new, and if you all want to get busy and send a message to your congressman, there's a new pesticide, it's a Roundup and 2,4-D combined. And what they've already shown in research is that it causes kidney cancer in rats. And yet, EPA, my husband works for EPA, but EPA went ahead and approved this stuff. But now there's 30-some congressmen, it's in the Northwest Herald this morning, 30-some congressmen have asked for this to be relooked at. Roundup itself causes genetic and human problems. So we need to start, getting onto our congresspeople and making sure that we get back to that natural way of producing food, like you're saying, without using all these chemicals, because Roundup Ready is causing really serious problems down the road. Thank you.
I just want to comment briefly. I mean, I think there's a lot, of research out there showing that not only some of, Roundup and other sort of Monsanto branded chemicals are causing health problems, but we're destroying our pollinators, we're destroying a lot of the biodiversity that could be natural on farms. I don't want this to seem like an anti-chemical argument, though. I think, chemicals in agriculture can have their place, sort of like medicine for all of us. They can be used to help people or help crops get over an illness. I think what the Green Revolution did, however, is make the use and misuse of agrochemicals and other artificial inputs, sort of an everyday thing rather than being able to use them in a time of crisis or to, help your farm, stabilize from a wheat rust or from an infestation of pests. So I think we need to, be aware that chemicals can have their place, but that we've misused them, and we need to figure out better ways of doing agriculture so that we don't have to rely on them and their cost every day that we're farming, that we can use them judiciously.
There's lots to talk about, clearly. So lots of things to get into, and I encourage you to stick around for a minute. Danielle's going to be able to stick around for a little while, chat with some of our partners for the evening out there. But first, please help me in thanking Danielle for coming to MCC.
Thank you. Thank you all. Thank you.